We're gonna go over why you should save $10,000 ASAP. The biggest factor here is when I first saved and got to the point of having $1 million, and then when my wife and I got to the point where a year later we were valued over $5 million, I reflected back on some of the early lessons. And some of the big things that my wife forced me to do early on is to put ourselves into a position of just working towards benchmarks. Okay, so when we work towards these specific benchmarks, I was going through life with my spouse, with my wife, just sort of doing whatever we wanted to do. And she would consistently say, like, hey, we should have some type of goal. At some point, we need to have more income than expenses. Okay, and so when we started to establish what's that first benchmark that we could work towards, we looked at this and said, let's just work towards 10,000 bucks. Let's try to get to $10,000 and figure out what that would mean for us. And that led us to just constantly thinking towards, can we have more income than expenses? Okay, if we can just do that, we can start working towards that $10,000. And what that ends up doing is it creates a goal, it provides some sense of freedom for you, and then it gives you this greater sense of responsibility. Now you know that you're able to do this. And so I think that establishing those processes, okay, and looking at the first step is just to get to 10,000 bucks. Okay, and then you can simplify it from that point on. And that takes us from just thinking through the lens of, if I can have more income than expenses, I can work towards this goal of having $10,000. I can learn along the way of what that means to get to the $10,000 process, right? And then I can start to recognize that there's different things that I can do once I have $10,000 that I couldn't do when I didn't have $10,000. And stress, some forms of stress, can get alleviated. Now, that takes us into that second thing, which is going to be, it's an educational process. So I remember when we first started to save the money towards working towards that $10,000 goal, I had no idea what a T-bill was, what a treasury bill was. I had no idea what a high interest savings account was. I didn't understand simple things like interest. And I remember looking and playing around with compounding interest calculators and being absolutely blown away by, if we continued this process and got past $10,000, what would be the next benchmark? And then what would that benchmark look like if we started to use compounding interest, if we started to use things like T-bills, like very, very simple stuff. And so this educational process then started to open up this entirely different world. And of course, at an early point, you get very, very overwhelmed. Okay, so you start to wonder, like, well, geez, I'm in over my head. How am I ever going to save $10,000? Or how am I ever going to save $100,000? But we can come back down and say, all right, step one, $10,000. Now we're learning that through this educational process what these different things are. So the next thing that we can do is actually lead into having some awareness of how we're living. Okay, once we have some awareness of how we're living, that's going to enable us to look at very specific things. Okay, so when we're looking at how we're living, we can start to think through, what am I spending my money on? Okay, that's like the first step. Let's just pick up, open up an actual bank account. You look at your bank account online and you just write down what you're spending your money on, right? And then you can look at, what are you making? Okay, these are very simple things. So the first thing here is, once you start to have this awareness of how you're living, you go, okay, what am I actually making in a month? What am I making in a week? Okay, even breaking it down further, what am I making every single day? Because when you start to think in those smaller chunks, you start to be a little bit more aware of what your value is and how you can actually start to have more income than expenses. So this thought process, all starting with that $10,000 as your goal, as your benchmark, and then looking through learning what these specific things are and then being aware, right? So now we're going into just looking at our bank account, looking at our pay stubs, trying to break down exactly what we're making on a daily basis and then on a weekly basis. And then you start to be much more aware of what you're expending your money on. So if I go to the grocery store, I'm a little bit more aware of what I'm spending that money on. And when I'm a little bit more aware of what I'm spending that money on, I have a much higher likelihood now, because I can relate this back to what I make in a single day or in a single week. I have a much higher likelihood to buy something of substantial value instead of just buying something for the sake of buying something. So when we have this awareness of living, we start to prioritize things. We're not just going through life doing random things. Instead, we're actually making precise decisions, simply going back to the goal, okay? And that big goal, outside of having that $10,000, comes back to literally having more income than expenses. So when we're going through this and we're saying, all right, if I'm making this much money on a daily basis, I should not be spending more than what I'm making, right, on a daily basis. And think through that for the time horizon of a week. Think through that for a time horizon of a month. And it really is as simple as looking at your checking account, looking at your credit card bill, and looking through, what am I spending money on? Okay, and once you start to think through, what am I spending my money on, that takes us into this next aspect, which is going to be budgeting and budgeting strategies, okay? And so I remember when we first started to think through, okay, let's just establish a budget. Even just establishing a budget was extraordinarily overwhelming. Looking online and going, okay, there's a $0 budget strategy, there's a 60-20-20 budget strategy, there's a 50-30-20, there's so many different budgeting strategies that I had no clue where to even start. And even to the point of fixed costs versus variable costs, looking at all those things, what does that even mean? And so when we started to think through this process, we wanted to just first look at the awareness of how we're living. Okay, what are we spending on housing? What are we spending on our cars? What are we spending on utilities? What are we spending on food? Like those simple things right there. Okay, so you've got housing, vehicle, your automobile, utilities, and food, and just starting at that point. Okay, so those are things that are going to everyone's going to be spending money on them every single month. Now, the way that you can control these things is you can look at it and you can say, okay, utility bills we can control to a point. We can decrease our cable bill, we can decrease how much electricity we're using, we can decrease how much oil we might be spending, or how we're heating our home. We can look at things like what size of our house or apartment or room are we living in and we're renting. And you can start to make these very specific thought processes and ideas around this. And then you can even go to food. Okay, well, if we want to have this goal of saving $10,000, let's not eat out for 3 months. Just try it. Let's not eat out for 3 months and see if that decreases our food bill. Let's only buy whole foods for 3 months straight and see if that decreases our food bill. Let's not drink alcohol for 3 months, see if that decreases our food bill. When we look at automobiles, we can sit there and say, okay, instead of having a car payment, let's buy a used car. I want to share this quick story right now, is that we established this thought process of, we don't want to buy new vehicles until our combined usage, each car, is over 300,000 miles. Okay, so if we have 2 cars, we don't want to buy a new car until we have over 300,000 miles compiled between the 2 cars. So what that does is it commits you to not buying a new car. It commits you to buying a reliable vehicle. It commits you to taking care of that vehicle. And then you don't have added expenses long term, but you're just constantly striving towards this $10,000 goal, that $10,000 benchmark, based off the strategy that we're committed to just dealing with this vehicle and we're going all in on this car. Okay, and then all of those things start to compound, but it's really, instead of being overwhelmed by the actual budgeting strategy, it's just being aware of how you're living. And then it's looking at, okay, if we have these fixed costs, we have these variable costs, the variable cost being something like cable bills or cell phone bills or even energy and things like that, and we can have, or food bills, we can have a positive impact on those things. Let's try to see how much we can decrease them to see how quickly we can get to $10,000 saved. And that really creates this incredible sense of empowerment. Okay. I remember the first time that we had $10,000 saved, me being a little bit of an idiot, I wanted to immediately go on Craigslist and buy a used truck. I remember thinking, wow, I have $10,000. I could buy a 1992 Dodge Power Ram right now, and it wouldn't matter. I could do it. And I remember going through and thinking, and I ended up doing that quite a bit. I ended up thinking through like all the things that I could buy that I wanted to buy. And I made a lot of bad decisions because of that. But what ends up happening is that you have this sense of empowerment because you achieved a goal. You set the benchmark and you sat there and you actually achieved it. And so then the next thing that you can do is you can start to learn, instead of why do I need to save $10,000? Well, I need to save $10,000 so that I can recognize I need more income than expenses. I can recognize what is my budget? I can recognize the awareness of how I'm living. I can start to get educated on the financial process. And then on each and every single benchmark thereafter, I have a new sense of empowerment, which leads to a new sense of purpose, which can then help you in your financial goals and in your financial story. And so really saving $10,000 is much more than just that number of the $10,000 bills that you have, right? It becomes this process of working towards and becoming more aware of how things are happening around you so that you have less stress working towards the next level. Because as you work towards each level, you start to learn more. You start to see things that are a little bit more complicated. You start to get more stressed by this complexity of everything that you're looking at. But if you all just come back down, if everything comes back down to it's a process to get to the next benchmark, that enables you to simplify it and just be aware of where that money is going, where that money is coming from, what your time value is, and then what you're actually expending it on, what you're spending your money on. This leads to that greater sense of empowerment. So the big factor here is just continue to make processional gains with your education, know where the money's going, have some type of budgeting capability to start off with. Just look at real simple things. Don't get overwhelmed, okay? And then work through those different budgets and what those strategies are. And then that takes you to that next process. So in the next video, we're gonna go over some of those very specific things that are gonna help you get to $10,000.